There are deaths that change history, that mark the end of eras, that force entire nations to confront what has been lost. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi died such a death. 78 years old, frail but determined, walking to evening prayer in New Delhi on January 30th, 1948, when 3 bullets fired at point-blank range ended a life that had freed Astiavosai, nation and inspired a world. This is the story of a small man who became enormous, of a shy boy who became a leader of millions, of a traditional Hindu who adopted radical methods, of someone who changed the world not through violence, but through its refusal. It is the story of satyagraha, truth force, of passive resistance that proved more powerful than armies, of moral authority that shook an empire. The narrative moves slowly, from a coastal town in Gujarat where a young boy was born into a merchant family, through marriage at 13 and struggles in London, to South Africa where racial discrimination forged him into an activist, to India, where he led the independence movement through decades of resistance, to the partition that divided the subcontinent and broke his heart, to that final evening when an assassin's bullets silenced the apostle of nonviolence. If you find peace in this story, consider leaving a like, subscribing, or sharing where in the world you're listening tonight. Now to the beginning, to a house by the sea, to a child born into a world he would help transform. Chapter 1. Porbandar, 1869. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was born on October 2nd, 1869 in Porbandar, a coastal town in Gujarat on the western edge of India. The town was small, unremarkable except for its white limestone buildings that gave it the name the White City, situated on the Arabian Sea where merchants traded, where fishing boats returned with their catches, where life moved at the slow rhythm of seasons and tides. He was born into a family of the Bania caste, merchants and traders who had served for generations as administrators in the small princely states of Gujarat. His father, Karamchand Gandhi, served as the Dewan, Prime Minister of Porbandar, then later of other small states, a position of respect and modest influence. His mother, Putlibai, was Karamchand's 4th wife, deeply religious, devoted to Vishnu, observing strict vows and fasts, spending hours in temple prayer. Mohandas was the youngest of 4 children, the 4th son, not particularly remarkable as a child, quiet and somewhat timid, afraid of the dark, afraid of snakes and ghosts, clinging to his older brother for comfort. The family was comfortable but not wealthy, lived in a traditional 3-story house, observed Hindu customs and rituals, participated in the life of their community without standing out or attracting special attention. His mother's religiosity shaped him profoundly. Putlibai was a devotee of the Pranami sect, which blended Hinduism with Islamic ideas, emphasizing non-violence and vegetarianism, teaching that all religions contained truth, that sectarian differences were less important than moral conduct. She fasted frequently, sometimes for days, would not eat until she'd seen the sun, sometimes gave up food entirely if she'd spoken harshly or felt she'd committed any wrong. Mohandas absorbed these teachings, learned the importance of vows and self-discipline, internalized his mother's emphasis on ahimsa, non-violence, though he would not fully embrace these principles until much later. As a child he was ordinary, played with friends, attended school without distinguishing himself, was more notable for his shyness than for any particular brilliance or ambition. He was deeply attached to his parents, particularly to his mother whose approval he craved, whose religious devotion impressed him even when he did not fully understand it. His father was distant but not unkind, occupied with administrative duties, respected in the community, living by traditional Hindu values while maintaining friendships with Muslims and Jains, modelling a religious tolerance that would later become central to Gandhi's own philosophy. Porbandar was a place of multiple communities living together. Hindus of various castes, Muslims, Parsis, Jains, all coexisting without the severe tensions that characterize some other parts of India. The boy Mohandas saw religious diversity as normal, saw people of different faiths cooperating and respecting each other, absorbed an instinctive pluralism that would later make him resistant to religious communalism and partition. School was difficult at first. Mohandas was timid, struggled with confidence, was intimidated by teachers and older students. He was not a natural scholar, found memorization tedious, was more comfortable with practical activities than with books, but he was honest, conscientious, unwilling to cheat or to cut corners, qualities that teachers noticed and appreciated even if his academic performance was mediocre. He learned English in school, studied arithmetic and geography and history, received a traditional Indian education supplemented by British curriculum. The education system was designed to produce clerks and administrators for the British colonial government, to create Indians who could help govern India, but who accepted British superiority and British rule as natural and inevitable. The family moved when Mohandas was 7, relocating to Rajkot where his father had been appointed Dewan. Rajkot was larger than Porbandar, had more schools and more opportunities, was closer to the centres of power in Gujarat. The move was beneficial for the family, advanced Karamchand's career, gave the children access to better education. But Mohandas remained shy, self-conscious, uncomfortable in social situations. He was teased by other boys, was not athletic or aggressive, preferred reading to sports, spent time alone rather than seeking attention. He developed a stammer that made speaking difficult, that increased his reluctance to participate in class or to engage in debates. He was ordinary in almost every way, showed no signs of the extraordinary path his life would take. His childhood was shaped by duty, religion, and the quiet expectations of a traditional Hindu family. He was being prepared for an ordinary life, education, marriage, work as a clerk or administrator, raising a family, participating in his community, living and dying without particular distinction. The empire that ruled India seemed permanent, unchangeable, too vast and powerful to resist. The boy Mohandas, timid and unremarkable, could not have imagined that he would one day challenge that empire, that he would lead millions, that his name would be known around the world. Chapter 2. Child Marriage. In May 1883, when Mohandas was 13 years old, his family arranged his marriage to Kasturbai Makanji, a girl of the same age from a similar Bania family in Porbandar. The marriage was typical for the time and place, a traditional Hindu wedding, arranged by parents between children too young to understand what marriage meant, part of social custom that emphasized family alliance and social duty over individual choice or romantic love. Mohandas later described himself as having been excited about the wedding, about the ceremonies and celebrations, about the new clothes and the attention, but he was also confused, uncertain what was expected, embarrassed by the physical aspects of marriage that he did not fully understand. He was 13, she was 13. Neither had been educated about marriage or sexuality. Both were navigating a relationship imposed by family tradition. Kasturbai, called Kasturba or Ba, was illiterate, had received no formal education, had been raised to be a dutiful wife, to manage a household, to serve her husband and raise children. She was strong-willed, more confident than Mohandas, less easily intimidated, capable of standing up to him in ways that surprised and sometimes frustrated him. The marriage was not easy, particularly in the early years when Mohandas tried to impose control, to assert traditional husbandly authority that Kasturba resisted. Mohandas became jealous and possessive, tried to control where Kasturba went, whom she saw, what she did. He wanted her to learn to read and write, tried to teach her, became frustrated when she was not interested, or when household duties took precedence. The tension between them was real, reflected both Mohandas's insecurities and the inherent difficulties of child marriage, of two young people forced into intimacy before either was ready. But there was also affection, companionship, the slow building of partnership that comes from shared life. Kasturba was patient with Mohandas's moods, tolerated his attempts at control, maintained her own independence while fulfilling her duties as a wife. Over decades, the relationship would deepen, would become central to both their lives, would endure separations and hardships and disagreements, would demonstrate a love that was real even if it was complicated. While still in school, Mohandas fell under the influence of a friend who introduced him to ideas that conflicted with his family's values. The friend argued that meat-eating would make Indians strong, that the British ruled India because they ate meat while Indians were weak from vegetarianism, that embracing meat-eating was a form of resistance against cultural inferiority. Mohandas, curious and somewhat rebellious, agreed to experiment. He ate meat secretly several times, felt guilty but also felt drawn to the transgression, to the assertion of independence from family and tradition. But the guilt became unbearable. Lying to his parents, violating his mother's strict vegetarian household, betraying values he'd been raised with. He confessed to his father, wrote a letter admitting what he had done, asking for forgiveness while promising never to repeat the offence. His father's response was remarkable. Karamchand was ill, weak, lying in bed when he read Mohandas's confession. He read the letter. Tears ran down his face. He said nothing. The tears, the silent forgiveness, the refusal to condemn or punish, affected Mohandas profoundly. He saw the pain his actions had caused, understood that moral authority came not from punishment but from love, learned a lesson about truth-telling and forgiveness that would shape his entire life. In 1885, when Mohandas was 16, his father died. Mohandas had been caring for him, had been attentive and devoted, but on the night of his father's death, he left his father's bedside to go to his wife, giving in to sexual desire. While he was with Kasturba, his father died. An uncle came to tell him, and Mohandas was devastated, felt that he had failed in his duty, that his father had died without him present because he'd been unable to control himself. The guilt haunted him, became part of his later rejection of sexuality, his embrace of brahmacharya, celibacy, as spiritual discipline. He saw the incident as a moral failure, as evidence that sexual desire was dangerous, that it distracted from duty, that controlling it was necessary for spiritual growth. The memory of his father dying while he was with his wife became a source of shame that he never entirely overcame. That same year, Kasturba gave birth to their first child, a son who lived only a few days. The loss was painful, but Kasturba and Mohandas were both very young, would have other children, would build a family despite the difficulties of their early marriage. The child's death was one sorrow among many in a life that was only beginning to reveal its sorrows and its purposes. Mohandas completed his schooling in Rajkot, passed his matriculation examination, enrolled briefly in Samaldas College in Bhavnagar, but he struggled with the curriculum, found university-level studies difficult, was uncertain what career to pursue. The family discussed his future, considered options, eventually settled on a plan. Mohandas would go to England to study law, would become a barrister, would return to India qualified for a prestigious career as a lawyer or administrator. The decision was controversial. Going to England meant crossing the black waters, which Orthodox Hindus believed was polluting, would result in loss of caste. Mohandas's mother was reluctant, worried that he would be corrupted, that he would abandon Hindu values and practices. To reassure her, Mohandas took a vow. He would not touch wine, women, or meat. He would remain a vegetarian, would remain celibate, would not abandon his Hindu identity. With his mother's blessing secured by the vow, With financial support from his family and his brother, Mohandas prepared to leave for England. He was 19 years old, married with a young son, Harilal, born in 1888. Leaving his family behind, travelling to a country he knew only through books, hoping to transform himself from a shy, uncertain boy into someone worthy of respect and success. England would challenge him, would expose him to new ideas and values, would begin the process of transformation that would eventually make him Mahatma Gandhi. But in 1888, as he boarded the ship for England, he was simply Mohandas, leaving home for the first time frightened and hopeful, carrying his mother's vow and his own ambitions toward an unknown future. Chapter 3. London. Student Mohandas Gandhi arrived in England in October 1888, aged 19, dressed in white flannel suit, wearing a silk hat, carrying his vegetarian vow and his provincial background into the heart of the British Empire. London was overwhelming, vast, industrial, cold, foreign in every way. He was homesick immediately, struggled with the food, the language, the customs, felt out of place among English people and among the few other Indian students he encountered. His first weeks were difficult. He tried to become an English gentleman, bought new clothes, learned to tie a tie properly, took lessons in dancing and elocution and French, tried to remake himself into someone who belonged in London society. But the effort was expensive and largely unsuccessful. He was too shy for dancing. His stammer made elocution difficult. He felt ridiculous pretending to be something he was not. The vegetarian vow created constant difficulties. English food was meat-based. Restaurants served little that he could eat. Boarding houses where he stayed could not accommodate his dietary restrictions. He was often hungry, lost weight, struggled to find adequate nutrition. But the vow was sacred, a promise to his mother, something he would not break despite the hardships it created. Eventually he discovered a vegetarian restaurant in London, found a community of English vegetarians who were experimenting with meatless diets for ethical and health reasons. The discovery was transformative. He was no longer alone in his vegetarianism, was no longer simply following a Hindu custom, but was participating in a movement, embracing values that had rational and ethical justifications beyond religious tradition. He read books about vegetarianism, about diet reform, about the ethics of killing animals for food. He discovered that his mother's values, which he had followed out of duty, had philosophical foundations that appealed to his intellect. He became a vegetarian by choice rather than merely by obligation, joined the London Vegetarian Society, wrote articles for their journal, found confidence through advocacy for a cause he believed in. The vegetarian movement introduced him to people who challenged conventional thinking, who questioned social norms, who believed that individual choices about diet and lifestyle had moral and political implications. He met socialists, theosophists, people experimenting with alternative lifestyles, people reading Tolstoy and Ruskin and Thoreau. The exposure broadened his thinking, introduced him to ideas about simplicity, non-violence, civil disobedience, moral reform. He studied law, attended lectures at University College London, read legal texts, prepared for the bar examination. Law was not particularly interesting to him, but it was practical, was a path to a career, was what he had come to England to study. He was a diligent student, memorized legal principles and procedures, passed examinations adequately if not brilliantly. During his time in London, he attempted to read religious texts, to understand his own Hindu tradition more deeply. Theosophist friends introduced him to the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu scripture that would become central to his philosophy. He read it for the first time in English translation, was moved by its teachings about duty, about detachment, about acting without desire for results. The Gita's concept of doing one's duty without attachment to outcomes resonated with him. would later become foundational to his political philosophy. He also read the Bible, particularly the Sermon on the Mount, was struck by Jesus' teachings about turning the other cheek, about loving enemies, about the blessed nature of peacemakers and those who suffer for righteousness. The Christian ethics of non-resistance to evil, of responding to violence with love, appealed to him deeply, seemed consistent with Hindu teachings about ahimsa, suggested universal ethical principles that transcended particular religious traditions. His reading was eclectic, undisciplined, driven by curiosity rather than by systematic study. He read Tolstoy's The Kingdom of God is Within You, which argued for Christian anarchism, for rejection of government authority, for resistance to evil through non-violent means. He read John Ruskin's Unto This Last, which criticized industrial capitalism, argued for the dignity of labor, suggested that a good society required simplicity and equality. He read Thoreau's Civil Disobedience, which defended the individual's right and duty to resist unjust laws. These readings planted seeds, introduced ideas that would germinate later, that would shape his thinking about resistance, about social organization, about the relationship between individual conscience and state authority. In London, he was not yet a political activist, was not yet thinking about independence or resistance, was simply a student trying to complete his studies and return home to a legal career. He passed the bar examination in June 1891, was called to the bar, enrolled in the High Court of England, became a barrister qualified to practice law. The achievement was significant, represented years of effort, fulfilled the purpose for which he had come to England. He was 21 years old, educated, credentialed, ready to return to India to begin his career. But he was also changed, subtly but significantly. He had been exposed to ideas that challenged traditional thinking, had encountered people who lived by ethical principles rather than by convention, had begun to think about vegetarianism and simplicity and non-violence as more than just Hindu customs, but as universal values with philosophical foundations. He had gained confidence, had overcome some of his shyness, had learned to function in foreign environments. He left England in June 1891, sailed for India, returned to his family, to his wife and his young son whom he had not seen for 3 years, to the expectation that he would establish a legal practice and pursue a conventional career. He could not have known that his time in England, which had seemed focused on legal education, had actually been preparing him for something entirely different, that the ideas he'd encountered would become the foundation for a philosophy that would challenge an empire and inspire a world. But the transformation had begun. The seeds had been planted, and the shy boy from Porbandar was becoming someone capable of extraordinary things. Chapter 4, South Africa Arrival. Gandhi returned to India in 1891, hoping to establish a legal practice in Bombay or Rajkot, to build a career, to support his growing family. But the legal profession proved difficult. He was too shy to speak effectively in court, lacked confidence when cross-examining witnesses, found the competition overwhelming. His first case in a Bombay court ended in humiliation when he could not speak, simply stood in silence, unable to utter a word, finally sat down in defeat while the courtroom watched. He retreated to Rajkot, tried to establish a practice writing legal documents and advising clients, but generated little business, earned barely enough to survive. He was failing. His expensive English education seemed wasted. His family's investment in his training appeared to have produced nothing. He was 24 years old, had a wife and 2 sons now, Harilal and Manilal, and no clear path forward. Then, in April 1893, an opportunity arrived. Dada Abdullah, a wealthy Indian Muslim merchant in South Africa, needed legal assistance with a lawsuit in Pretoria. The case required someone who could understand the documents, which were in English, and who could represent Abdullah's interests. The job would pay well, would last about a year, would allow Gandhi to escape his failures in India. He accepted immediately. Gandhi arrived in Durban, South Africa in May 1893 expecting to complete his legal work and return home, but South Africa would transform him, would expose him to racial discrimination so systematic and humiliating that it would awaken his political consciousness, would force him to confront injustice, would begin his evolution from a failing lawyer into a political leader. His first encounter with racism came within days of arrival. He boarded a train from Durban to Pretoria, held a first-class ticket purchased through his employer, sat in the first-class compartment. A white passenger objected to his presence. Summoned railway officials demanded that Gandhi move to third class. Gandhi refused, showed his valid ticket, insisted on his right to the seat he had purchased. The officials ordered him to move. He refused again. They threw him off the train at Pietermaritzburg station, confiscated his luggage, left him on the platform on a cold winter night. Gandhi sat in the station waiting room shivering, humiliated, furious, trying to decide what to do. He could return to Durban, abandon the job, go back to India. Or he could continue to Pretoria, complete his work, endure whatever humiliation was necessary. But something shifted during that long night. He decided that running away would solve nothing, that the discrimination he faced was systematic, affected all Indians in South Africa, needed to be challenged. The train incident was not isolated. Gandhi faced constant discrimination, ordered to ride outside stagecoaches rather than inside with white passengers, denied accommodation at hotels, refused service in restaurants, beaten by a stagecoach driver for objecting to his treatment. Each incident reinforced his understanding that Indians in South Africa, regardless of education or wealth, were treated as inferior, were subject to laws and customs designed to humiliate and control them. South Africa in the 1890s was a complex society. The British controlled Natal and the Cape Colony, while the Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers, controlled the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. Both British and Boers agreed on one thing: non-whites were inferior and should be kept subordinate. Indians, brought to South Africa initially as indentured labourers to work on sugar plantations, faced severe discrimination, were subject to special taxes, were required to carry passes, were restricted in where they could live and work. Gandhi completed his legal work for Dada Abdullah, helped negotiate a settlement that avoided costly litigation, demonstrated skill as a mediator and negotiator. He prepared to return to India in June 1894, but at a farewell party, he learned about proposed legislation that would strip Indians of the right to vote in Natal. He was outraged, urged the Indian community to resist, to petition the government to organise opposition. The community asked him to stay, to lead the resistance effort. Gandhi agreed, postponed his return to India, threw himself into organising, writing petitions, mobilising the Indian community. He had found his purpose, had discovered that he was capable of leadership when fighting for justice, that his legal training and his English education gave him tools to challenge discrimination. He founded the Natal Indian Congress in August 1894, modelled on the Indian National Congress, an organisation to represent Indian interests, to coordinate resistance to discriminatory laws, to assert Indians' rights as British subjects. He wrote pamphlets, organised meetings, collected signatures on petitions, corresponded with government officials, used every legal and political tool available to challenge injustice. His work attracted attention and hostility. White residents saw him as troublemaker, as someone stirring up Indians who should accept their subordinate position. When Gandhi returned to Durban in 1897 after a visit to India to fetch his family, a white mob attacked him, tried to lynch him, beat him severely before he was rescued by the wife of the Durban police superintendent. Gandhi refused to press charges against his attackers, argued that they were products of a system that taught racial hatred, that punishing individuals would not change the system. The incident demonstrated both the dangers he faced and his emerging philosophy of responding to violence without seeking revenge. He was developing the ideas that would become satyagraha, though he had not yet named them, had not yet articulated them as a coherent philosophy. He was learning through experience that moral authority could be more powerful than legal rights, that willingness to suffer without retaliating could expose injustice, that perseverance in the face of violence could eventually shame opponents into change. During these years, Gandhi brought his family to South Africa, Kasturbai and their sons, living in South African Indian community, building a life while fighting for justice. He established a legal practice that thrived, earned good money representing Indian clients, could have lived comfortably if making money had been his goal, but increasingly, he was drawn to simplicity, to service, to subordinating personal comfort to political and moral purposes. South Africa was not what Gandhi had expected when he accepted the temporary legal assignment. He had planned to stay a year, had thought he would complete his work and return to India. Instead, he stayed more than 20 years, built a movement, developed a philosophy, transformed himself from a shy, failing lawyer into a leader capable of challenging empires. The transformation began on the cold night at Pietermaritzburg station, when a young man thrown off a train decided not to run away but to resist, to fight discrimination not with violence but with dignity and determination and truth. Chapter 5. The Satyagraha Birth. The word Satyagraha, truth force, soul force, was coined in South Africa in 1906, during a campaign against the Transvaal government's requirement that all Indians register with authorities, submit to fingerprinting, carry registration certificates at all times. The law was humiliating, treated Indians as criminals, reduced free people to the status of subjects under surveillance. Gandhi and the Indian community decided to resist. But how to resist? Violence was impractical. The Indian community was small, unarmed, would be crushed by government force. Legal challenges had limited effect. The courts supported discriminatory laws, offered little protection. Conventional political pressure accomplished little. The government did not care about Indian opinion, had no incentive to compromise. Gandhi proposed a different approach: mass refusal to register, willingness to accept arrest and punishment, persistence in non-cooperation regardless of consequences. The approach was not passive. It required courage, discipline, organization, but it was non-violent, relied on moral authority rather than physical force, aimed to shame the government into withdrawing the law rather than to defeat it militarily. At a mass meeting in Johannesburg in September 1906, Gandhi asked the Indian community to take a solemn vow, to refuse registration, to accept whatever punishment resulted, to persist until the law was repealed. The meeting was emotional. People understood the risks, knew they might lose businesses, face imprisonment, suffer violence. But they took the vow, committed to resistance, trusted Gandhi's leadership. The campaign began in July 1907 when the registration period opened. Indians refused to register, submitted petitions, held meetings, maintained discipline. The government began arrests, imprisoned resistors, imposed fines. Gandhi was among those arrested, was sentenced to 2 months' imprisonment, was sent to jail in January 1908. Prison was transformative. Gandhi discovered that he could survive hardship, that imprisonment did not break him, that suffering for a cause gave his life meaning. He read extensively in prison, religious texts, philosophy, politics, used the time for study and reflection. He began to see imprisonment not as punishment but as opportunity, not as defeat but as part of resistance. He was released after negotiating a compromise with General Jan Smuts, the Transvaal leader. Gandhi agreed to voluntary registration if the government promised to repeal the mandatory registration law. But Smuts betrayed the agreement, kept the law, left Gandhi feeling deceived. The betrayal taught Gandhi not to trust government promises, to insist on concrete actions rather than verbal assurances. The campaign continued, escalated. Indians burned their registration certificates in public ceremonies. Hundreds courted arrest, filled the jails, maintained non-violent discipline despite provocations. The government responded with violence. Police beat protesters, deported resistors, confiscated property. But the resistance continued, drew international attention, embarrassed the South African government. During these years, Gandhi experimented with communal living, establishing settlements where families lived simply, worked cooperatively, practiced self-sufficiency. Phoenix Settlement, founded in 1904 near Durban, and later Tolstoy Farm near Johannesburg, became laboratories for Gandhi's ideas about simple living, manual labour, religious tolerance, cooperative economics. The settlements reflected Gandhi's reading of Tolstoy and Ruskin, his conviction that modern industrial society was corrupt, that true life required simplicity, that manual labour was dignified and necessary. Residents grew their own food, made their own clothes, educated their children, lived without luxuries. Gandhi worked alongside everyone else, cleaned toilets, cooked meals, tended crops, insisted that no work was beneath anyone. He also experimented with brahmacharya, celibacy, despite being married with 4 sons. In 1906, he took a vow of celibacy, announced it to Kasturbai, explained that sexual desire distracted from spiritual and political work, that controlling it would increase his moral authority. Kasturbai accepted the decision, though not without reservations, supported his vow while maintaining the practical work of managing household and family. The celibacy vow was controversial, reflected Gandhi's complex relationship with sexuality, his belief that desire was dangerous, that self-control was necessary for spiritual growth. Critics later pointed to the vow as evidence of Gandhi's problematic views on sexuality, his imposition of his own struggles onto others, his elevation of celibacy as morally superior to married sexuality. The Satyagraha campaigns continued through 1913, focusing on various discriminatory laws, marriage laws that did not recognize Hindu and Muslim marriages as legal, taxes imposed on former indentured labourers, restrictions on Indian, movement between provinces. Gandhi organised strikes, marches, non-cooperation campaigns, using each struggle to refine satyagraha methods, to build community discipline, to demonstrate that non-violent resistance could achieve results. The climax came in November 1913 with a march from Natal to Transvaal. Over 2,000 people, including women and children, walking to court arrest, to fill jails, to force the government to negotiate. Gandhi was arrested multiple times during the march, was imprisoned, was released, continued organising. The march drew international criticism of South African racial policies, created pressure that the government could not ignore. Finally, in June 1914, the Indian Relief Act was passed, addressing major Indian grievances, marriage recognition, tax abolition, improved rights of movement. Gandhi had not achieved everything the community wanted, but he had demonstrated that non-violent resistance could force government concessions, that organised suffering could defeat systematic oppression, that moral authority was a form of power. In July 1914, Gandhi left South Africa, sailing for England and then to India. He had spent 21 years in South Africa, had arrived as a failing lawyer, was leaving as a successful political leader, had developed the philosophy and methods that would transform Indian independence movement. Satyagraha had been born, tested, refined in the crucible of South African resistance. Now it would be brought to India, would be deployed against British rule, would challenge the greatest empire the world had seen. Chapter 6. Return to India. Gandhi arrived in India in January 1915, age 45, returning after more than 2 decades abroad. He was not unknown. His South African work had been reported in Indian newspapers, had gained him admirers including Gopal Krishna Gokhale, a prominent Indian National Congress leader who had visited South Africa and who had urged Gandhi to return to India to work for independence. But Gandhi was also not yet the Mahatma, the great soul that he would become. He was one activist among many, one voice in a complex independence movement that included moderates who sought gradual reform through petition and dialogue, extremists who advocated violence against British rule, and numerous regional and religious groups with competing visions for India's future. Gokhale advised Gandhi to spend a year travelling through India, observing conditions, learning about the country, understanding the challenges before jumping into politics. Gandhi took the advice, spent 1915 and 1916 touring India by train and on foot, visiting villages, meeting ordinary Indians, seeing poverty and oppression firsthand, understanding the dimensions of the problems facing the country. What he saw shocked him. India was poor, desperately poor, with millions living in conditions of hunger and disease that he had not fully grasped while living abroad. The British Raj maintained order and infrastructure but extracted wealth from India, used India's resources for Britain's benefit, treated Indians as subjects whose role was to serve empire rather than to govern themselves. The caste system enforced rigid hierarchies, kept millions of untouchables in degrading conditions, denied them access to temples and schools and wells, forced them into occupations considered polluting, cleaning latrines, handling dead animals, leatherworking. Gandhi was troubled by untouchability, saw it as a stain on Hinduism, began to advocate for the integration of untouchables into Hindu society, insisting that all Hindus were equal regardless of caste. He settled in Ahmedabad in Gujarat, established Sabarmati Ashram on the banks of the Sabarmati River, creating a community modelled on his South African settlements. The ashram emphasised simple living, manual labour, religious tolerance, social equality. Members spun cotton, grew food, educated children, practiced self-sufficiency. Gandhi insisted that untouchables be welcomed, that caste distinctions be eliminated, that everyone work together regardless of background. His first major political involvement came in 1917 in Champaran, a district in Bihar where indigo farmers were forced by British planters to grow indigo on their land, to sell their crops at prices fixed by the planters, to live under conditions approaching serfdom. The farmers invited Gandhi to investigate their grievances, to help them resist exploitation. Gandhi went to Champaran, conducted a detailed investigation, interviewed hundreds of farmers, documented systematic exploitation. British authorities ordered him to leave the district, threatened him with arrest if he stayed. Gandhi refused to leave, was arrested, appeared in court, argued that moral duty required him to stay, that helping oppressed farmers was more important than obeying unjust orders. The publicity generated by his arrest embarrassed the government, forced them to establish an official inquiry into conditions in Champaran. Gandhi served on the inquiry committee, presented evidence of exploitation, recommended reforms. The government implemented some reforms, improved conditions for indigo farmers, demonstrated that British rule was not omnipotent, that organised resistance could achieve results. The Champaran success established Gandhi's reputation in India, showed that his South African methods could work in India, that Satyagraha could challenge British rule. He followed Champaran with a campaign in Ahmedabad in 1918, supporting textile workers striking for better wages, introducing fasting as a political tool. Gandhi fasted until the mill owners agreed to arbitration, used his suffering to create pressure for settlement. Later in 1918, he led farmers in Kheda district in Gujarat in a campaign against land taxes during a time of crop failure. The farmers refused to pay taxes until the government provided relief, maintained discipline despite government pressure, eventually won partial concessions. Each campaign refined Gandhi's methods, built his reputation, attracted followers, demonstrated that non-violent resistance was practical politics rather than just moral philosophy. But Gandhi's position on the First World War was controversial. He supported the British war effort, recruited Indians for the British Army, argued that Indians should demonstrate loyalty in Britain's hour of need, that supporting the war would strengthen India's claim for self-government after the war ended. Many Indians were dismayed, felt that Gandhi was betraying independence principles, that supporting British imperialism's war contradicted his anti-colonial politics. Gandhi's logic was pragmatic. He believed that Indian self-government required British consent, that cooperation during the war would create goodwill, that demonstrating loyalty would strengthen Indian political claims. He also believed that learning military skills would prepare Indians for self-defense, that serving in war would build confidence and organization. But the reasoning was strained, reflected Gandhi's evolving understanding of how to achieve independence, his willingness to compromise principles for political gains. The war ended in November 1918 with British victory. Indians expected promised reforms, expected movement towards self-government, expected recognition of their wartime contribution. But instead, the British government passed the Rowlatt Acts in March 1919, extending wartime emergency powers, allowing indefinite detention without trial, suppressing political activity, demonstrating that British gratitude for Indian support did not include meaningful political reform. The Rowlatt Acts outraged Gandhi, convinced him that cooperation with the British was futile, that more aggressive resistance was necessary. He called for a nationwide Hartal, a day of protest, of work stoppage, of prayer and fasting, of non-violent resistance to unjust laws. The Hartal on April 6, 1919 was widely observed, shut down businesses and schools, demonstrated the potential power of mass non-violent resistance. But the protest did not remain entirely non-violent. In Punjab, demonstrations turned violent, British property was attacked, several British civilians were killed. The British response was brutal, culminating on April 13, 1919 in Amritsar, when British troops under General Reginald Dyer opened fire on an unarmed crowd gathered in Jallianwala Bagh, a walled garden. Dyer ordered his troops to fire without warning, to continue firing until ammunition was exhausted. At least 379 people were killed, over 1,000 wounded, in a massacre that shocked India and the world. Gandhi was devastated by the violence, both by the Amritsar massacre and by the violent acts committed by Indians during the protests. He called off the Satyagraha campaign, announced that he had committed a Himalayan blunder in launching mass resistance before the people were adequately trained in non-violence. He fasted, prayed, sought to understand what had gone wrong, to learn how to prevent future violence. But the Amritsar massacre was a turning point, convinced many Indians that British rule was not benevolent, that independence was necessary, that compromise with imperialism was impossible. Gandhi emerged from the crisis with clarity. He would lead a mass movement for complete independence, would use non-violent methods, would not rest until India was free. The Gandhi who returned to India in 1915 had been cautious, uncertain, seeking his role. By 1920 he was ready to challenge an empire. Chapter 7, Champaran and Ahmedabad. The Champaran campaign in 1917 was Gandhi's first major intervention in Indian politics, the moment when his South African experience began to reshape Indian resistance. The district in Bihar was dominated by indigo plantations, where British planters forced Indian farmers to grow indigo on a portion of their land, to sell the crop at prices fixed by the planters, to accept conditions that left farmers perpetually indebted. Rajkumar Shukla, a farmer from Champaran, had been travelling across India seeking help, trying to find someone willing to investigate and challenge the system. He met Gandhi at the Indian National Congress session in Lucknow in December 1916, followed him persistently, begged him to come to Champaran. Gandhi agreed, seeing an opportunity to apply satyagraha methods to an Indian problem. Arriving in Champaran in April 1917, Gandhi began systematic investigation, interviewing farmers, documenting exploitation, collecting evidence. British authorities were alarmed by his presence, ordered him to leave the district immediately, threatened arrest if he refused. Gandhi replied that he could not in conscience obey an order that prevented him from helping oppressed people, that he would accept arrest and punishment rather than abandon the farmers. He was arrested, tried, prepared to go to jail, but the publicity created by his arrest embarrassed the British administration, made the indigo system visible to wider India and to the world. The Lieutenant Governor of Bihar intervened, appointed an official inquiry committee to investigate conditions, invited Gandhi to serve on the committee. The strategy of using arrest to generate publicity had worked, had forced government response. Gandhi served on the inquiry committee but also continued independent investigation, spent months in Champaran villages, lived among farmers, understood their lives and their suffering. He opened schools, improved sanitation, provided medical care, demonstrated that social service was inseparable from political resistance, that helping people required addressing immediate needs as well as challenging systemic exploitation. The inquiry committee's report, issued in October 1917, confirmed systematic exploitation, recommended reforms including eliminating compulsory indigo cultivation, giving farmers freedom to choose crops, and compensating farmers for past injustices. The recommendations were largely implemented. The worst abuses were ended. Farmers gained significant relief. The victory was important not just for the farmers, but for Gandhi's reputation and methodology. He'd shown that careful investigation, non-violent pressure, willingness to accept arrest, and persistence could achieve concrete results against British power. The methods were replicable, could be applied to other grievances, offered a model for resistance. In early 1918, Gandhi became involved in a labour dispute in Ahmedabad, where textile workers sought a wage increase to compensate for rising prices. Mill owners refused, threatened to close mills, argued that workers should accept economic hardship as necessary for business viability. Workers asked Gandhi, who lived in Ahmedabad, to support their cause. Gandhi mediated, tried to negotiate settlement, proposed arbitration, but mill owners rejected compromise, maintained their refusal to increase wages. Gandhi advised workers to strike, to maintain discipline and non-violence, to persist until justice was achieved. He supported the strike actively, attended meetings, gave speeches, maintained morale. But the strike dragged on, workers became demoralized, some were tempted to accept the mill owners' terms. Solidarity was fraying. Gandhi, seeking a way to maintain momentum to give workers courage, announced that he would fast until the dispute was resolved. He would not eat until mill owners agreed to arbitration, or workers gave up the strike. The fast was controversial, seemed to many like emotional blackmail, like using personal suffering to coerce settlement. But it was effective. Mill owners, who knew and respected Gandhi, were uncomfortable with his suffering on behalf of their workers, agreed to arbitration after 3 days. The arbitrator ruled largely in favour of the workers. They received a substantial wage increase. The strike ended in victory. The Ahmedabad strike introduced fasting as a political weapon, as a form of self-suffering that created moral pressure, that appealed to opponents' conscience, that demonstrated the seriousness of the activists' commitment. Gandhi would use fasting repeatedly throughout his career, would refine its use, would make it one of his most powerful tools for moving hearts and changing minds. Later, in 1918, Gandhi organised farmers in Kheda district in Gujarat, who faced famine conditions after crop failures, but were still required to pay full land taxes to the British government. The farmers petitioned for tax relief, provided evidence of crop failure, requested government assistance. The government refused, insisted on full tax payment, threatened to confiscate land and property of those who did not pay. Gandhi advised farmers to refuse to pay taxes, to accept confiscation of property, to maintain non-violent discipline, to persist until the government provided relief. Wealthy farmers who could afford taxes paid them, but poorer farmers refused, faced seizure of their possessions, endured hardship without violence. The campaign demonstrated rural Indians' capacity for organised resistance, showed that Gandhi's methods could mobilise agricultural populations. The government eventually compromised, suspended tax collection from the poorest farmers, provided partial relief, ended the worst consequences of the crop failure. The victory was limited but real, established Gandhi's credibility with rural Indians, showed that he understood agricultural issues, that he was willing to fight for farmers' interests. These three campaigns, Champaran, Ahmedabad, Kheda, established Gandhi's methods and reputation in India, demonstrated that South African techniques worked in India, that non-violent resistance could win concrete victories. They also developed Gandhi's philosophy, his understanding of how suffering could be transformative, how discipline could be maintained, how moral authority could be built through visible willingness to accept punishment. Gandhi was learning what worked in the Indian context, what mobilized people, what sustained movements, what forced government concessions. He was building the foundation for the mass movements that would follow, for the non-cooperation campaigns, for the Salt March, for the civil disobedience that would eventually shake British rule. The small campaigns of 1917 and 1918 were laboratories, experiments, proving grounds for the methods that would later be deployed on a national scale, that would ultimately bring down an empire. Chapter 8: The Rowlatt Acts. In March 1919, the British colonial government in India passed the Rowlatt Acts, legislation that extended wartime emergency powers, allowed detention without trial, authorized trials without juries, empowered police to arrest suspects on suspicion of sedition. The acts were a response to growing nationalist activity, to British fears that the end of World War I would unleash demands for independence, to determination to maintain control through coercion if necessary. Indians were outraged. They had supported Britain during the war, had sent soldiers and resources, had been promised constitutional reforms and movement towards self-government as reward for loyalty. Instead, the Rowlatt Acts tightened British control, criminalised political activity, demonstrated that British promises were worthless, that imperialism would not voluntarily relinquish power. Gandhi called the Rowlatt Acts unjust, subversive of the principles of liberty and justice, and destructive of the elementary rights of the individual. He announced that he would organize nationwide resistance, would call for a Hartal, a day of prayer, fasting and work stoppage, a day of non-violent protest to demonstrate Indian unity against tyranny. The Hartal was scheduled for April 6, 1919, Palm Sunday. Gandhi asked Indians of all religions to observe the day, to close businesses, to stay home from work, to spend the day in prayer and reflection, to demonstrate that India rejected the Rowlatt Acts, that Indians would not cooperate with unjust laws, The response was extraordinary. Across India, millions observed the Hartal, cities shut down, businesses closed, workers stayed home, people gathered for prayer meetings, demonstrated peacefully. The scale of the protest shocked the British, demonstrated Gandhi's ability to mobilize mass resistance, showed that non-violent methods could create unity across India's diverse populations. But maintaining non-violence proved difficult. In some cities, particularly in Punjab, protests turned violent. In Amritsar, demonstrators attacked British property, killed several British civilians, burned buildings, destroyed telegraph lines. The British response was to impose martial law, to ban public gatherings, to arrest protest leaders including local Congress members. On April 13, 1919, the day of Baisakhi, an important Sikh festival, a large crowd gathered in Jallianwala Bagh, a public garden in Amritsar. Many in the crowd were celebrating the festival, were unaware that public gatherings had been banned, were there for innocent purposes, but British authorities viewed the gathering as defiance, as challenge to martial law, as sedition requiring forceful response. General Reginald Dyer, the military commander, marched 50 troops armed with rifles to the garden. Jallianwala Bagh was enclosed by walls with only narrow exits. The crowd was trapped, had no easy way to escape. Dyer ordered his troops to open fire without warning, aimed at the densest parts of the crowd where casualties would be maximized. Continued firing for approximately 10 minutes until ammunition was running low. The death toll was disputed but substantial. Official British figures listed 379 killed, though Indian sources claimed over 1,000 dead. More than 1,200 were wounded. Dyer offered no medical assistance to the wounded, left them lying in the garden overnight, imposed a curfew that prevented families from searching for victims. The wounded who survived did so because relatives defied the curfew to search for them. Dyer defended his actions, argued that he was teaching Indians a lesson, that ruthless force was necessary to maintain British authority, that showing weakness would encourage further rebellion. Many British officials and settlers in India praised him, raised money for his defence, celebrated him as someone willing to do what was necessary to maintain white supremacy. But the massacre shocked India and much of the world. The scale of the killing, the absence of warning, the lack of medical assistance to wounded, Dyer's explicit statement that he intended to terrorize Indians into submission, all demonstrated that British rule relied on violence, that imperialism was fundamentally brutal, that promises of benevolent governance were lies. Gandhi was devastated. He blamed himself, believed that he had launched mass resistance before adequately preparing people for non-violence, that he was responsible for the violence committed by protesters and therefore indirectly responsible for the government's brutal response. He called off the Satyagraha campaign, announced that he had made a Himalayan miscalculation, that mass resistance required more preparation, more discipline, more training in non-violence. He fasted, prayed, withdrew from active politics for months, sought to understand what had gone wrong. But he also learned crucial lessons, that non-violence required more than just asking people not to use violence, that it required training, organization, leadership discipline, that mobilizing masses without adequate preparation was dangerous, that sustaining non-violent movements required careful planning. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre radicalized Indian opinion, convinced many moderates that cooperation with British rule was futile, that independence was the only acceptable goal, that British promises of reform could not be trusted. The Indian National Congress, which had sought gradual constitutional reform, increasingly embraced Gandhi's call for complete independence, for non-cooperation with British institutions, for mass resistance. The massacre also changed Gandhi, convinced him that British rule was irredeemably unjust, that imperialism could not be reformed but had to be ended, that Indians had to be willing to suffer and sacrifice for freedom, that independence would not be given but would have to be won through sustained resistance. The cautious Gandhi who'd returned to India in 1915 was gone, replaced by a Gandhi ready to lead mass movements, to challenge empire, to demand complete independence. The Rowlatt Acts, intended to suppress nationalism, had instead strengthened it, had united Indians in opposition to British rule, had created conditions for the mass movements that would follow. Gandhi emerged from the crisis of 1919 ready to launch the non-cooperation campaign, ready to organise millions, ready to transform India's independence movement from elite politics into mass resistance. The Mahatma was being born, forged in the fires of Jallianwala Bagh, tempered by suffering and failure and determination to create a free India. Chapter 9. Non-cooperation. In 1920, Gandhi launched the non-cooperation movement, calling on Indians to withdraw cooperation from British institutions, to boycott British goods, to refuse participation in government, to build parallel Indian institutions to demonstrate that British rule depended on Indian cooperation and could be undermined by its withdrawal. The strategy was comprehensive. Students should leave government schools, lawyers should abandon British courts, workers should quit government jobs, soldiers should resign from the British Army, taxpayers should refuse to pay taxes, consumers should boycott British cloth, Indians should create their own schools, their own courts, their own institutions, should govern themselves, should act as though independence had already been achieved. The Indian National Congress endorsed the programme at its Nagpur session in December 1920, with Gandhi now effectively leading the organisation, transforming it from an elite debating society into a mass movement, bringing millions into political activity, making independence a popular demand rather than just an elite aspiration. Central to non-cooperation was the Swadeshi movement, promotion of Indian-made goods, particularly hand-spun cloth. Gandhi urged Indians to spin cotton themselves, to weave their own cloth, to burn foreign cloth in public demonstrations, to dress in khadi, simple hand-spun cotton, rather than in British-manufactured textiles. He made spinning a patriotic act, a moral duty, a practical assertion of self-reliance. The spinning wheel became Gandhi's symbol, represented his philosophy of self-sufficiency, his critique of industrial capitalism, his vision of village-centred India. He spent hours spinning daily, carried a portable spinning wheel, made spinning a meditation and a political statement. The image of Gandhi at his spinning wheel became iconic, represented his commitment to simplicity, his identification with the poor, his rejection of modernity's materialism. Thousands of students left government schools and colleges, enrolled in national schools established by the Congress, studied under Indian teachers, learned history and culture from Indian rather than British perspectives. Lawyers abandoned lucrative practices, gave up British honours and titles, dedicated themselves to serving the national movement. Government employees resigned, accepted economic hardship rather than collaborating with British rule. British cloth was boycotted, merchants refused to sell it, consumers refused to buy it. Bonfires of foreign cloth were organised in cities across India. The boycott hurt British textile manufacturers, cost them significant revenue, demonstrated the economic pressure could be as effective as political protest, that Indians controlled enough of India's economy to inflict pain on British interests, but maintaining non-violence remained challenging. In February 1922, in the town of Chauri Chaura in Uttar Pradesh, protesters clashed with police. 22 police officers were killed when protesters set fire to a police station. Violence undermined the movement's non-violent claims. Gandhi was devastated, announced suspension of the non-cooperation movement, began a 5-day fast, took personal responsibility for the violence. The decision to suspend the movement was controversial. Many leaders felt that momentum was being wasted, that one violent incident should not derail an otherwise successful campaign, that continuing pressure on British rule was more important than absolute non-violence. But Gandhi was adamant. Mass movements that could not maintain non-violence were dangerous, risked descending into chaos, would give the British justification for brutal suppression. In March 1922, Gandhi was arrested and charged with sedition for articles he had written criticising British rule. At his trial, he pled guilty, delivered a statement accepting responsibility for inciting discontent, argued that British rule was inherently unjust, that Indians had a duty to resist, that he would accept whatever punishment the court imposed. The judge sentenced him to 6 years' imprisonment, praised his high ideals while condemning his methods. Gandhi served 2 years of the sentence before being released in February 1924 for health reasons. Prison was productive. He read extensively, wrote, reflected, developed his ideas about non-violence and social reform, used time in solitary confinement for spiritual discipline and political analysis. He emerged from prison convinced that independence would require sustained effort, that one campaign would not be sufficient, that building a movement capable of overthrowing British rule would take decades. During the 1920s, with Gandhi often in prison or focused on social reform rather than political agitation, the independence movement fragmented. The Indian National Congress split between those who wanted to continue non-cooperation and those who wanted to participate in limited self-government institutions the British had established. Hindu-Muslim tensions increased. Communal violence became more common. The unity that Gandhi had built began to erode. Gandhi focused on what he called constructive program, social reforms intended to strengthen Indian society, to prepare India for independence, to address problems that would not automatically disappear with British withdrawal. He worked to eliminate untouchability, to integrate Dalits, the untouchables, into Hindu society, to open temples and wells to all castes, to end the social segregation that denied millions their dignity. He promoted spinning and hand-weaving, established ashrams where people lived simply, practiced self-sufficiency, learned crafts, built institutions that would sustain independent India. He promoted Hindu-Muslim unity, worked to prevent communal violence, argued that independent India must be secular, must protect all religious communities, must reject the religious nationalism that would divide the country. He experimented with education, establishing schools that emphasize practical skills, manual labour, character formation rather than just academic learning. He promoted village development, arguing that India's future lay in its villages, that industrialization and urbanization were harmful, that a good society required simplicity, equality, and connection to land and community. These activities seemed less dramatic than mass resistance, less directly confrontational with British rule, less politically exciting than the non-cooperation campaigns, but they were essential preparation, building the social foundation that would support independence, creating institutions and practices that would outlive British rule, addressing problems that politics alone could not solve. The non-cooperation movement, though suspended in 1922, had demonstrated that mass resistance was possible, that millions of Indians could be mobilized, that British rule depended on Indian cooperation, that withdrawing that cooperation created genuine pressure for change. The lessons learned would inform later campaigns, particularly the civil disobedience movement of the 1930s, the Salt March, the final push for independence that would succeed where non-cooperation had fallen short. Gandhi was building, patient and persistent, toward the goal of Swaraj, self-rule, that would justify all the suffering and sacrifice and disciplined resistance that Indians were being asked to provide. Chapter 10. Salt March. By 1930, Gandhi had been organising, teaching, building movements for more than a decade in India. The non-cooperation movement had been suspended, the constructive programme continued, but no major resistance campaign had been launched since the early 20s. The British seemed secure, independence seemed distant. Many Indians wondered whether Gandhi's methods could actually force British withdrawal, or whether they were simply symbolic gestures without real power. Gandhi was waiting for the right moment, the right issue, the right campaign that would unite India, dramatise British injustice, mobilise masses, create pressure that the British could not ignore. In 1930 he found it. The salt tax, a British monopoly on salt production and sale that required Indians to purchase salt from the government, to pay taxes on a basic necessity, to accept that they could not freely harvest something as simple as salt from the sea. The salt tax was regressive, hurt the poor disproportionately, was widely resented, but seemed too trivial to be the focus of major political campaign. Many Congress leaders were sceptical when Gandhi proposed a campaign focused on salt, thought he should address more obviously important issues: constitutional reform, political representation, civil liberties. Salt seemed unworthy of serious attention. But Gandhi understood the symbolism, understood that salt affected every Indian, that the injustice was visible and understandable, that harvesting salt from the sea was a simple act that anyone could perform, that making salt illegally would dramatise British tyranny, would unite India in resistance to an absurd law. He announced that he would lead a march from his Sabarmati ashram to the coast at Dandi, would walk nearly 240 miles, would make salt illegally, would challenge the British to arrest him. On March 12, 1930, Gandhi and 78 ashram residents began the march, walking roughly 10 miles per day, stopping at villages along the way, holding prayer meetings, explaining the campaign, inviting people to join. The march attracted enormous attention. Journalists followed, the international press covered it extensively. Thousands lined the route to see Gandhi pass. The march became a media event, focused global attention on Indian independence. Gandhi was 60 years old, thin, frail-looking, walking with a staff dressed in simple white khadi, leading a column that grew daily as more people joined. He spoke at each village, explained that the salt tax was unjust, that Indians had a right to make salt freely, that challenging this one law would demonstrate that British rule depended on Indian cooperation, that Indians could withdraw that cooperation. The march took 24 days, covered miles of dusty roads, through heat and exhaustion, with Gandhi walking the entire distance despite his age, maintaining discipline, keeping the marchers focused and non-violent. On April 5, 1930, the marchers reached Dandi, camped on the beach overnight, woke before dawn on April 6th. At approximately 6:30 in the morning, after ritual bathing and prayers, Gandhi walked to the sea, bent down, picked up a small lump of natural salt from the beach, held it up, announced, "With this, I am shaking the foundations of the British Empire." The act was simple, symbolic, powerful. Gandhi had broken the salt law, had made salt illegally, had defied British authority in the most direct and visible way possible. Within hours, people across India were making salt, boiling seawater, evaporating brine, harvesting natural salt deposits, breaking the salt law in thousands of locations. The British arrested people by the tens of thousands, filled jails to overflowing, tried to suppress the movement through mass imprisonment. But they could not arrest everyone, could not prevent people from making salt, could not enforce a law that millions were simultaneously breaking. Gandhi was arrested on May 4, 1930, charged with sedition, imprisoned without trial. His arrest did not stop the movement. Leadership passed to others, the campaign continued, expanded beyond salt to include boycotts of British goods, tax refusal, picketing of British institutions, the brutality of British response, police beating peaceful protesters, mass arrests, violent suppression, was filmed and photographed, broadcast globally, created international condemnation. The most dramatic incident occurred at Darrison Assault Works on May 21, 1930, where thousands of protesters attempted to enter the government salt facility, where police beat them with steel-tipped clubs, where protesters approached in waves, accepting beatings without resistance, where bodies piled up, where the discipline of non-violent resistance was demonstrated in the most vivid and terrible way. American journalist Webb Miller witnessed and reported the scene. His account shocked readers worldwide, demonstrated that Gandhi's followers would suffer rather than fight, that moral authority could persist even through physical destruction. The civil disobedience movement of 1930 to 1931 did not immediately achieve independence, did not force British withdrawal, did not accomplish all its objectives, but it demonstrated that British rule was increasingly untenable, that governing India required constant coercion, that Indians would not accept subjugation, that independence was inevitable even if its timing remained uncertain. Gandhi was released from prison in January 1931, began negotiations with the British, eventually signed the Gandhi-Irwin Pact, agreeing to suspend civil disobedience in exchange for release of political prisoners and participation in roundtable conferences to discuss India's constitutional future. The pact was controversial. Many felt Gandhi had conceded too much, had gotten too little, had agreed to negotiations when the movement had momentum. But Gandhi believed in negotiation, believed that British withdrawal required agreement, not just coercion, that constitutional arrangements for independent India needed to be developed through dialogue, that violence could be avoided if both sides were willing to compromise. He was willing to suspend resistance to create space for negotiation, willing to risk criticism to pursue peaceful resolution. The Salt March became legendary, was recognized globally as a brilliant example of non-violent resistance, demonstrated that moral authority and symbolic action could challenge power effectively. The image of Gandhi picking up salt, of thousands marching to the sea, of protesters accepting beatings without resistance, became iconic, inspired resistance movements worldwide, showed that oppression could be resisted without violence, that ordinary people could challenge empires through disciplined non-cooperation. The march also revealed Gandhi at the height of his powers, strategist and saint, political leader and moral teacher, someone who understood both the practical requirements of mass movements and the spiritual foundations of non-violence, someone capable of uniting millions in pursuit of freedom while maintaining discipline and purpose. The small man in simple cloth, walking with a staff, had shaken an empire. British rule would last another 17 years, but the Salt March made clear that its days were numbered, that India would be free, that Gandhi's methods would succeed. Chapter 11. Roundtable Conferences. In September 1931, Gandhi travelled to London to attend the Second Roundtable Conference, a British government initiative to discuss constitutional reform for India, to negotiate arrangements for eventual self-government, to find a path toward independence that would protect British interests while satisfying Indian demands. Gandhi attended as the sole representative of the Indian National Congress, the organisation that claimed to speak for all India, tasked with negotiating India's political future. The first Roundtable Conference in late 1930 had been boycotted by Congress, had been attended primarily by representatives of Indian princes, minorities, and British interests, had produced little of substance. Gandhi's participation in the second conference was intended to ensure that mainstream Indian nationalism was represented, that negotiations were serious, that progress toward independence was possible. Gandhi travelled to London by ship, staying in third-class accommodations, living simply, maintaining his daily routines of prayer and spinning, refusing any special treatment. His arrival in Britain was a media sensation. Newspapers covered his every move. Photographers followed him constantly. Crowds gathered to see the famous Indian leader who had challenged the empire through salt-making and spinning wheels. He stayed in London's East End, in settlement houses serving the poor, refusing comfortable accommodation in wealthy neighbourhoods, insisting on living among working-class people, demonstrating his solidarity with the powerless. He visited textile workers in Lancashire, whose jobs had been hurt by Indian boycotts of British cloth, explained his philosophy, listened to their concerns, expressed sympathy while insisting that Indian independence required economic self-sufficiency. The conference itself was frustrating, made little progress. British officials, representatives of Indian princes, leaders of minority communities including Muslims and untouchables, all had competing interests, different visions for India's future. The British wanted to maintain maximum control, to divide Indians along religious and communal lines, to ensure that independence would not threaten British economic and strategic interests. Gandhi argued for unified India, for independence as quickly as possible, for a constitution that would treat all Indians equally regardless of religion or caste, for an India that would not be divided along religious lines. But Muslim representatives led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah insisted on separate representation for Muslims, argued that Muslims needed protections against Hindu majority rule, began articulating demands for Muslim political autonomy that would eventually lead to the creation of Pakistan. Representatives of untouchables, including Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, argued that Dalits needed separate political representation, that Hindus could not be trusted to protect untouchable rights, that integration into Hindu society as Gandhi advocated was insufficient, that untouchables needed constitutional guarantees of political power. The British, hoping to divide Indians, supported separate electorates for Muslims and untouchables, knowing that division would weaken Indian unity. Gandhi opposed separate electorates, argued that they would balkanize India, would create permanent divisions, would prevent national unity, would make governing independent India impossible. He particularly opposed separate electorates for untouchables, argued that they were Hindus, that the solution to untouchability was reforming Hinduism, not separating Dalits politically, that separate electorates would make the situation worse, not better. The conference ended in December 1931 without agreement, having achieved nothing substantive, having revealed deep divisions among Indians, having demonstrated that independence would be complicated by religious and caste conflicts, that unity would be difficult to maintain, that British strategy of divide and rule was effective. Gandhi returned to India in December, disappointed but not defeated, convinced that British would not voluntarily grant independence, that resumed resistance would be necessary, that the political struggle would continue for years. He also returned to an India where the political situation had deteriorated. The British had arrested Congress leaders during his absence, had suppressed political activity, had reimposed harsh controls. In January 1932, Gandhi was arrested again, was imprisoned in Yaweda jail in Pune, would spend most of the next 2 years in prison. But even from prison, he influenced events, particularly through fasting, using self-starvation as political weapon, as means of creating pressure, as demonstration of seriousness that could move hearts and force negotiations. In September 1932, the British government announced the Communal Award, establishing separate electorates for Muslims as Sikhs and untouchables, institutionalizing religious and caste divisions, creating the political fragmentation that would make unified Indian independence more difficult. Gandhi was outraged, particularly by separate electorates for untouchables, announced that he would fast unto death unless the provision was removed. The fast began on September 20th, 1932, focused attention on untouchability, on the question of whether Dalits were Hindus or a separate community, on whether Hindu society would reform or would accept permanent division. Gandhi's life hung in the balance. Negotiations proceeded frantically. Hindu leaders desperate to save Gandhi were forced to negotiate with Dalit leaders, particularly Ambedkar, to find an alternative to separate electorates. The Pune Pact, signed on September 24, 1932, replaced separate electorates with reserved seats within joint electorates. Untouchables would vote in general elections, but a certain number of seats would be guaranteed for untouchable candidates, ensuring representation without creating separate political identity. Ambedkar reluctantly agreed. Gandhi ended his fast, the immediate crisis was resolved. But the issue revealed deep tensions. Ambedkar believed that Gandhi's paternalism toward untouchables was harmful, that caste Hindus could not be trusted to address Dalit oppression, that Dalits needed autonomous political power. Gandhi believed that the answer to untouchability was moral reform of Hinduism, that separation would make the problem worse, that integration was the only solution. The disagreement would never be fully resolved, would remain source of criticism of Gandhi. The Roundtable conferences demonstrated the complexity of achieving independence. It was not simply a matter of forcing British withdrawal. It also required resolving deep divisions within Indian society, creating political structures that could accommodate religious and caste diversity, building unity among communities with different interests and different visions for independent India's future. Gandhi was learning that political freedom was only one challenge, that social reform was equally important, that independent India would face problems that British presence had suppressed, but that would erupt once colonialism ended. Chapter 12. The War Years. In September 1939, Britain declared war on Germany, beginning the Second World War. The British Viceroy of India, without consulting any Indian leaders, announced that India was also at war, that Indian resources and Indian soldiers would support Britain's war effort, that India had no choice in the matter. Indians were outraged by this unilateral decision, by the arrogance of Britain declaring war on India's behalf without Indian consent, by the assumption that Indians existed to serve British interests. The Indian National Congress demanded that Britain clarify its war aims regarding India. Would India be granted independence after the war? Would Indians be given control over their own government during the war? Would India's contribution to the war effort be recognised by granting self-government? The British response was vague, offered only indefinite promises of eventual constitutional reform, provided no commitment to independence, made clear that British control would continue. Gandhi's position on the war was complex, evolved over its course, reflected his pacifism, his opposition to fascism, his insistence on Indian independence. He was opposed to fascism, sympathised with Britain and France, believed that Nazi Germany was evil, wanted to support the Allies morally, but he could not support the war effort militarily, could not ask Indians to fight for freedom abroad while denied freedom at home, could not cooperate with an empire that refused to grant India independence. In October 1940, Gandhi launched a limited individual satyagraha campaign. Selected individuals would offer civil disobedience against the war effort, would make anti-war speeches, would invite arrest, would demonstrate opposition to British. Policy without launching mass movement that might undermine Britain's war effort dangerously. The campaign was carefully calibrated, aimed at registering protest without sabotaging Britain's fight against Nazism. Thousands participated in individual satyagraha. Thousands were arrested. Thousands filled jails. But the campaign did not escalate, did not become mass movement, did not significantly affect the war effort. Gandhi was walking a difficult line, opposing British rule while not wanting to assist Nazi victory, asserting Indian rights while not actively undermining Allied military operations. The situation changed in December 1941 when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing America into the war, creating the Pacific theater where India's security was directly threatened. Japanese forces advanced rapidly through Southeast Asia, captured Singapore in February 1942, threatened India's eastern borders, seemed capable of invading India itself. Britain, facing potential Japanese invasion of India, needed Indian cooperation, needed to mobilize Indian resources and Indian soldiers, needed to ensure that Indians would fight rather than welcome Japanese as liberators from British rule. In March 1942, Sir Stafford Cripps arrived in India with proposals. Britain would grant India dominion status after the war, would allow Indians to draft their own constitution, would give provinces option to opt out of Indian Union, essentially offering independence with significant caveats. The Cripps mission failed. Congress rejected the proposals as too limited, as post-dated check that might never be honoured, as British attempt to divide India by allowing provinces to opt out. Muslim League also rejected proposals, demanding explicit recognition of Pakistan as separate Muslim nation. Gandhi called the proposals a post-dated check on a crashing bank, dismissed them as inadequate, insisted on immediate independence. Negotiations broke down. Britain refused to grant immediate independence, refused to transfer power during wartime, insisted that constitutional questions would have to wait until after war's end. Congress prepared for confrontation, for mass resistance despite wartime conditions, for demanding immediate independence regardless of strategic circumstances. The growing demand within Congress was for Quit India, a call for British to leave India immediately, to grant complete independence without delay, to accept that their rule was over. Gandhi was reluctant initially, worried about launching mass movement during war, concerned about potential chaos, hoping that negotiations might still succeed, but pressure from younger Congress leaders, from public opinion, from the logic of the situation pushed him toward more radical action. In July 1942, the Congress Working Committee passed the Quit India Resolution, demanding immediate British withdrawal, threatening mass civil disobedience if the demand was not met, calling on Indians to prepare for the greatest struggle yet. Gandhi was tasked with leading the movement, with organizing resistance, with mobilizing millions in final push for independence. On August 8, 1942, Gandhi addressed a Congress meeting in Bombay, gave a speech calling for resistance, urging Indians to do or die, declaring that this would be the final struggle, that Indians would either win freedom or perish. Trying. His rhetoric was more militant than usual, his tone more urgent, his message clear. The time for compromise was over. Independence must be achieved immediately. The next morning, August 9th, British authorities arrested Gandhi, arrested the entire Congress leadership, arrested thousands of Congress workers across India, moved preemptively to crush the Quit India movement before it could organize, to prevent coordination, to eliminate leadership. Gandhi and other leaders were imprisoned without trial, held in detention for the duration of the war, removed from political activity. But the arrest did not prevent resistance. They sparked it. Without central leadership, local resistance erupted across India, often violent, including attacks on British property, destruction of railway lines and telegraph wires, clashes with police, acts of sabotage. The British suppressed resistance brutally. Mass arrests, shootings, collective fines imposed on villages, harsh military occupation of disturbed areas. Thousands were killed, tens of thousands arrested, the movement crushed but not without significant struggle. Gandhi was imprisoned in Aga Khan Palace in Pune, held in relative comfort but completely isolated from political activity. The prison years were difficult. Kasturba was imprisoned with him, fell ill, died in February 1944 at age 74, dying in prison, losing her life to the cause of independence she had supported for decades. Gandhi mourned deeply, felt the loss profoundly, was released in May 1944 on health grounds, but was broken by Kasturba's death, by the suppression of Quit India, by the seeming failure of his methods. The war years were dark period for Gandhi and for the independence movement. Imprisoned leaders, suppressed resistance, growing Hindu-Muslim tensions, the Muslim League's increasing demand for Pakistan as separate Muslim nation, the spectre of partition hanging over independent India's future. When the war ended in August 1945, India was closer to independence, but also closer to disaster, to religious division that would tear the subcontinent apart. Gandhi would emerge from prison to face the greatest crisis yet. Not British rule, which was ending, but communal violence that threatened to destroy the unity he had worked decades to build. Chapter 13. Quit India. The Quit India movement of August 1942 was different from previous campaigns, more desperate, more spontaneous, less controlled, emerging from frustration that decades of resistance had not achieved independence, from recognition that the war created both danger and opportunity, from determination to force British withdrawal immediately rather than waiting for post-war negotiations. Gandhi's do-or-die speech on August 8, 1942 captured the mood. This was the final struggle. Indians would win freedom or sacrifice everything trying. Compromise was no longer possible. Patience was exhausted. His words were more militant than usual, acknowledged that non-violence might be impossible to maintain, suggested that chaos was preferable to continued subjugation. The British, aware of the planned movement, moved preemptively, arrested Gandhi and the entire Congress leadership before dawn on August 9th, detained them without trial, prohibited communication with the outside world, eliminated central coordination. The arrests were intended to decapitate the movement, to prevent organization, to create confusion that would prevent effective resistance. But the arrest had the opposite effect, sparked immediate spontaneous protests, created anger that overflowed into violence, demonstrated that popular frustration could not be controlled by arresting leaders. Without Gandhi's restraining influence, without Congress coordination, local resistance took forms that Gandhi would have opposed: attacks on government property, destruction of infrastructure, violence against officials. Students walked out of schools and colleges, joined protests, clashed with police. Workers struck, shut down factories, refused to cooperate with government. In rural areas, peasants attacked police stations, cut telegraph wires, destroyed railway tracks, disrupted communications and transportation. The British called it rebellion, mobilized military forces, declared martial law in affected areas. The suppression was brutal. Police and military units fired on crowds, arrested tens of thousands, imposed collective fines on villages suspected of harboring rebels, used torture to extract information, executed some captured rebels. Over 1,000 people were killed, many more wounded, approximately 100,000 arrested. The movement crushed within months through overwhelming force. But the movement demonstrated several things: that Indian demand for independence was genuine and widespread, not just elite political theatre, that resistance would continue regardless of arrests, that British rule depended on constant coercion, that governing India was becoming unsustainable. The British won the immediate battle but were losing the war, were exhausting resources to maintain control, were facing a population that would no longer accept subjugation. Gandhi, imprisoned in Aga Khan Palace, was isolated from the violence, learned about events through limited information, was troubled by reports of violent resistance, felt that the movement had failed because it had not maintained non-violence. He began a 21-day fast in February 1943, protesting his imprisonment, protesting British characterization of Congress as responsible for violence, seeking to demonstrate that his commitment to non-violence remained absolute. The fast was dangerous. Gandhi was 73 years old. Health was fragile. Doctors warned he might die. The British debated releasing him but decided against it. Wouldn't be seen as yielding to coercion, were willing to let him die rather than appear weak. Gandhi survived the fast but barely, was near death for days, recovered slowly, was weakened permanently. During imprisonment, Gandhi focused on internal Congress problems, particularly growing demands from Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the Muslim League for Pakistan as separate Muslim nation. Jinnah had been moving towards separation for years, arguing that Muslims and Hindus were separate nations, that Muslims needed their own state, that unified India would mean Muslim subjugation to Hindu majority rule. Gandhi opposed partition absolutely, believed that religious nationalism was dangerous, that dividing India would create violence and suffering, that Muslims and Hindus could live together in secular democratic India. But he was losing the argument. Muslim League had gained strength during the war, had positioned itself as representing Muslim interests, had convinced many Muslims that partition was necessary for their security. The defining tragedy of Gandhi's life was approaching. He would win independence but lose unity, would free India from British rule but watch it divide along religious lines, would see the violence and displacement and suffering that partition created, would spend his final years trying to prevent communal violence, trying to maintain unity that was disintegrating, trying to save lives when politics had failed. In May 1944, Gandhi was released from prison on health grounds, too weak to continue detention, unlikely to survive another incarceration. Kasturba had died in prison in February 1944, depriving Gandhi of his closest companion, the woman who had shared his struggles for over 60 years, who had supported his work despite personal sacrifices, who had died in British custody pursuing the independence her husband had dedicated his life to achieving. Gandhi emerged from prison to a changed landscape. The war was ending. British power was declining. Independence was imminent, but partition seemed likely. Communal violence was increasing. Hindu-Muslim relations were deteriorating. The final phase of Gandhi's life would be consumed by trying to prevent partition, by minimizing violence when partition occurred, by trying to save lives in the catastrophe that was approaching. The Quit India movement had not achieved its immediate goal of forcing British withdrawal in 1942, but it had demonstrated that British rule could not continue indefinitely, that governing India required resources and will that Britain no longer possessed, that independence was inevitable. The question was no longer whether India would be free, but whether it would be united, whether the subcontinent would emerge from colonialism as one nation or divided into hostile religious states, whether Gandhi's dream of secular united India would survive or would be destroyed by the communalism he had fought against for decades. Chapter 14. Partition's Shadow. As the Second World War ended in August 1945, British power was exhausted, Britain's economy was shattered, maintaining an empire was impossible, granting Indian independence was inevitable. The only questions were timing and terms. Would Britain withdraw quickly or gradually? Would India be unified or divided? What arrangements would govern the transfer of power? Elections held in late 1945 and early 1946 demonstrated political realities. Congress won most general seats, but Muslim League swept Muslim-majority constituencies, confirming that Jinnah spoke for most Muslims, that Muslim support for Pakistan was real and growing, that preventing partition would require addressing Muslim fears of Hindu-majority rule. Gandhi spent these months travelling through Bengal and Bihar, areas where communal violence between Hindus and Muslims had erupted, trying to stop killings, urging people to reject religious hatred, walking through villages, meeting with both communities, pleading for peace. He walked barefoot through areas where violence had occurred, fasted to compel peace, used his moral authority to create shame, to make violence unthinkable. His efforts had some success. Violence declined where he visited. Communities made peace pledges. Killing stopped temporarily. But the underlying tensions remained. The political trajectory toward partition continued. The communal hatred that had been inflamed by decades of British divide-and-rule policies and recent political mobilization could not be eliminated by one old man's pilgrimages. In March 1946, a British cabinet mission arrived in India to negotiate independence terms, met with Congress and Muslim League leaders, tried to find formula that would preserve Indian unity while protecting Muslim interests. The mission proposed a complex federal structure: weak central government, strong provinces grouped into Hindu-majority and Muslim-majority zones, autonomy for Muslim areas within united India. Both Congress and Muslim League initially accepted the plan but then backed away, unable to agree on details, unable to trust each other's commitments, unable to imagine cooperating in governing independent India. Jinnah moved decisively toward demanding separate Pakistan, declared that Muslims would never accept Hindu majority rule, called for Direct Action Day on August 16, 1946 to demonstrate Muslim determination. Direct Action Day led to the Great Calcutta Killing. 4 days of communal rioting in Calcutta, Hindus and Muslims attacking each other, thousands killed, the city descending into violence that police could not control. The violence spread to other areas: Bihar, Bengal, Punjab. Each communal massacre provoking retaliatory massacres, creating cycle of violence that fed on itself, that made partition seem inevitable because communities could no longer trust each other. Gandhi was devastated. Spent his 77th birthday in October 1946 walking through riot-torn Noakhali district in Bengal, visiting villages where Hindus had been massacred, urging survivors not to seek revenge, trying to restore communal harmony through his presence and his preaching. He walked village to village for 4 months, slept in villages, ate simple food, held prayer meetings, demonstrated that one Hindu could walk safely among Muslims if he came in peace. But political negotiations continued toward partition. British were determined to withdraw by June 1948, were unwilling to remain in India to prevent communal violence, insisted that Indians had to resolve their own conflicts, that Britain would not stay to manage religious tensions. The choice was stark: accept partition or face continued violence, compromise on unity or watch India descend into civil war. In February 1947, Britain announced that independence would come in June 1948, that power would be transferred to Indian leadership, that British forces would withdraw. In March 1947, Lord Mountbatten arrived as new Viceroy, tasked with managing the transfer, with negotiating partition if necessary, with ensuring British withdrawal occurred smoothly. Mountbatten accelerated the timeline, decided that waiting until 1948 would allow violence to worsen, determined to transfer power in August 1947 to complete partition quickly, to allow British forces to withdraw before the situation deteriorated further. The acceleration left little time for planning, little time to draw boundaries, little time to prepare for population movements, virtually guaranteed chaos. Gandhi opposed partition until the end, argued that dividing India was immoral, that it would create violence and suffering, that Muslims and Hindus could live together if political will existed. But he was increasingly isolated. Congress leaders, including Nehru and Patel, had accepted partition as inevitable, believed that quick independence with partition was better than delayed independence with continued violence, were exhausted by communal tensions and willing to let Muslim-majority areas go. In June 1947, Congress and Muslim League formally accepted partition, agreed to divide the subcontinent into India and Pakistan, to partition Punjab and Bengal between the two nations, to divide assets and military forces, to create two separate states based on religious identity. The decision was finalised in weeks. Boundaries were drawn by British lawyer Cyril Radcliffe, who had never been to India, who had no knowledge of local conditions, who drew lines on maps that would determine millions of lives. Gandhi did not attend the official independence celebrations on August 15, 1947, did not participate in the joy, spent the day fasting and praying in Calcutta, trying to prevent violence, mourning the division he had been unable to prevent. While others celebrated freedom, Gandhi grieved for the unity that had been lost, for the violence he knew would come, for the failure of his life's work to prevent partition. Independence and partition came simultaneously. On August 15, 1947, India and Pakistan became independent nations. British rule ended, but the subcontinent was divided. Communal violence exploded. Millions began migrating. Hindus and Sikhs fleeing Pakistan, Muslims fleeing India, attacks on refugee columns, massacres of minorities, chaos and killing on a scale that horrified the world. Estimates suggest that between 1 and 2 million people died in partition violence. Exact numbers will never be known. Bodies were never counted. Many disappeared without record. 10 to 20 million people were displaced, forced to leave homes and migrate to areas where their religion was the majority, lost property and livelihoods, started over in unfamiliar places, carried trauma that would last for generations. Gandhi had fought for Indian independence for more than 3 decades, had led mass movements, had gone to prison repeatedly, had fasted nearly to death, had mobilized millions, had created a philosophy of non-violent resistance that inspired the world. He had won independence but lost unity, had freed India from British rule but had failed to prevent partition, had lived to see his dream of secular, united India destroyed by religious nationalism he had spent his life opposing. The final months of his life would be consumed by trying to stop communal violence, by fasting for peace, by walking among rioters, by pleading for sanity and humanity and tolerance. He had defeated an empire but could not defeat religious hatred, had liberated a nation but could not prevent its division, had inspired millions but could not prevent them from killing each other. The tragedy of partition was the tragedy of Gandhi's life, the failure that would define his final days. Chapter 15. Independence and Division. August the 15th, 1947, should have been the culmination of Gandhi's life work. India free, the British Empire defeated, independence achieved through non-violent resistance, vindication of methods that many had doubted could succeed. But Gandhi did not celebrate, did not attend independence ceremonies in Delhi, did not participate in the joy that swept newly independent India. He was in Calcutta, in a Muslim house in a riot-torn neighbourhood, fasting and praying, trying to prevent communal violence, mourning the partition that had divided India, grieving for the unity he had been unable to preserve. While Nehru spoke of India's tryst with destiny, while flags were raised and crowds celebrated, Gandhi wept, spent the day in silence, refused food, contemplated the failure that accompanied the success. The violence that partition unleashed exceeded worst predictions. Entire villages massacred, trains full of refugees attacked, families murdered trying to reach safety, women abducted and raped, children killed, elderly left to die. Punjab, divided between India and Pakistan, descended into horror. Sikhs and Hindus attacking Muslims, Muslims attacking Sikhs and Hindus, each atrocity provoking retaliation, each massacre creating hatred that demanded revenge. Gandhi's presence in Calcutta had some effect. His fasting, his prayer meetings, his moral authority helped maintain some order, prevented total collapse into violence, demonstrated that religious peace was possible if people chose peace. But one man, however revered, could not stop the subcontinent-wide catastrophe, could not be everywhere, could not prevent all violence. In September 1947, Gandhi travelled to Delhi, found the capital overwhelmed by refugees, by communal tensions, by violence between Hindus and Muslims, by fear and hatred that threatened to destroy the city. He took up residence at Birla House, home of wealthy industrialist G.D. Birla, who supported Congress, began holding daily prayer meetings attended by hundreds, preaching peace, urging tolerance, condemning violence. He announced another fast in January 1948, his last fast protesting communal violence in Delhi, protesting government policies that discriminated against Muslims, demanding that Pakistan's share of financial assets from partition be paid despite Hindu objections, insisting that Indian Muslims be protected, that India live up to secular principles despite partition. The fast was controversial. Hindu nationalists accused Gandhi of being pro-Muslim, of betraying Hindu interests, of caring more about Pakistan than about India. The criticism was vicious, threatening, revealed how much communal hatred had intensified, how dangerous Gandhi's position was becoming. Death threats multiplied, warnings that someone would kill him if he continued favouring Muslims. But Gandhi continued, maintained the fast for 5 days until Hindu and Muslim leaders in Delhi signed peace pledge, promised to end violence, guaranteed protection for minorities, agreed to restore Hindu-Muslim cooperation. The fast succeeded in an immediate goal. Violence in Delhi decreased. The peace pledge was honoured temporarily. Gandhi had once again used self-suffering to create moral pressure for change. But the success was temporary. The situation was deteriorating. The communal poison was spreading. Hindu nationalist organisations, particularly the RSS, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, were gaining strength, preaching Hindu supremacy, arguing that India should be Hindu nation, that Muslims and other minorities should accept subordinate status or leave that Gandhi's secularism was weakness, not strength. These organisations saw Gandhi as obstacle, as someone preventing India from becoming truly Hindu, as someone whose tolerance for Muslims betrayed Hindu interests. Some members discussed eliminating Gandhi, plotted his assassination, believed that removing him would clear the way for Hindu nationalist agenda, for creating India defined by Hindu identity rather than by secular democracy. Gandhi was aware of the danger, received death threats regularly, was urged by security officials to accept more protection, to limit his public exposure, to reduce risks. But he refused. If someone wanted to kill him, he said, no amount of security would ultimately prevent it, and he would not live in fear, would not stop his public prayer meetings, would not abandon his work for peace because of threats. His daily routine continued. Morning prayers at 4 a.m., meetings with visitors, correspondence, attending to ashram duties, evening prayer meeting at 5 p.m. in Birla House Garden, open to anyone who wished to attend. No security screening, no barriers between Gandhi and the crowd, complete accessibility that made protection impossible. The prayer meetings were ecumenical, readings from Bhagavad Gita, Quran, Bible, Buddhist texts, affirming that all religions taught truth, that sectarian differences were less important than shared moral principles, that India must be secular, must respect all faiths, must reject religious nationalism. Gandhi's message was clear, uncompromising, directly challenging Hindu nationalist ideology. On January 20th, 1948, a bomb exploded during a prayer meeting intended to kill Gandhi, planted by Hindu nationalist conspirators. The bomb failed to kill Gandhi, caused panic but no deaths, exposed the assassination plot. Police investigated, arrested some conspirators, but failed to uncover entire network, missed the determination of those who decided Gandhi must die. Gandhi refused to cooperate with security measures, refused to modify his schedule, refused to accept that the danger was serious, continued prayer meetings as usual, continued preaching tolerance and peace, continued living without fear or special protection. He was 78 years old, frail, ready to die, believing that if someone killed him while he was doing his duty, while working for peace, that would be appropriate end to his life. India was independent but divided, free but traumatized, democratic but threatened by religious nationalism, peaceful in some places but violent in others. Gandhi had won the major struggle against British rule, but was losing the struggle for the soul of India, for preserving secular democratic values against religious communalism, for preventing Hindu nationalism from defining independent India's character. The final test was approaching. The ultimate challenge to Gandhi's commitment to non-violence was days away. An assassin was preparing, was planning, was determined to stop Gandhi from protecting Muslims, from preventing India from becoming Hindu nation. Independence had been achieved, but Gandhi's work was not finished, perhaps could never be finished, perhaps would end only when his life ended, when the apostle of non-violence finally became victim of the violence he had spent his life opposing. Chapter 16. The Final Fast. January 1948 was cold in Delhi, but Gandhi's schedule never varied. Up before dawn, prayers, meetings, spinning, more meetings. Then at 5 p.m., the evening prayer meeting in the garden of Birla House, where hundreds gathered to hear the old man speak about peace, about tolerance, about the need for Hindus and Muslims to live together, about the values that independent India must embody. His health was poor, he was thin to the point of emaciation. Age and decades of fasting had weakened him. Walking required support. His voice was faint, but he persisted, would not rest, would not retreat. Believed that as long as communal violence continued, as long as hatred poisoned India, he had to work, had to preach, had to set an example of peace. The fast of January 13th to 18th, 1948, had been particularly difficult. His body was exhausted. Doctors feared for his life. He was near collapse when the peace pledge from Hindu and Muslim leaders finally convinced him to end the fast. The recovery was slow, he remained weak, but he resumed his routine, attended prayer meetings, continued his work. During these final weeks, Gandhi met with the Prime Minister, with government officials, with ordinary people who came seeking his blessing or his advice. He corresponded with Pakistani leaders, with Nehru, with various political figures, trying to use his influence to reduce tensions between India and Pakistan, to protect minorities in both countries, to prevent the religious division from becoming permanent hatred. He also planned to go to Pakistan, had decided that his next major effort would be to walk through Pakistan as he had walked through riot-torn areas in India, to demonstrate that Hindus and Muslims could coexist, to preach peace in a country that had been created on the basis of religious separation. The trip would be dangerous, but danger had never deterred Gandhi. Suffering had never prevented him from doing what he believed was right. But Hindu nationalists were watching, were plotting, were determined that Gandhi's influence must end, that his protection of Muslims must stop, that India must be allowed to become a Hindu nation without Gandhi's interference. The conspiracy had been developing for months, involved multiple people, was centered on members of Hindu Mahasabha and RSS, organizations that preached Hindu supremacy. Nathuram Godse was the chosen assassin, a Brahmin from Pune, editor of a Hindu nationalist newspaper, member of Hindu Mahasabha, believer that Gandhi was destroying India by protecting Muslims Convinced that eliminating Gandhi was patriotic act, necessary to save Hindu interests, he had participated in the January 20th bomb attempt, had failed then, was determined not to fail again. On January 30th, 1948, Godse travelled to Delhi, carried a Beretta pistol, attended the evening prayer meeting at Birla House, positioned himself in the crowd as Gandhi arrived for prayers. Gandhi emerged from the house at 5:10 p.m., 10 minutes late, supported by his grandnieces Ava and Manu, walking slowly, greeting people with folded hands, moving toward the prayer platform. Godse moved forward through the crowd, pushed aside one of the grandnieces, approached Gandhi directly, brought his hands together as if in prayer greeting, then pulled out the pistol, fired 3 shots at point-blank range. The first bullet hit Gandhi in the chest. The second and third entered his abdomen. Gandhi fell, spoke his last words, "Hey Ram, oh God," and died within minutes, blood soaking his white shawl, his body collapsing onto the grass of Birla House garden, surrounded by shocked and grieving witnesses. The shots were heard across the garden, panic spread. People rushed toward Gandhi, tried to help, but nothing could be done. The wounds were fatal, life was leaving. Doctors arrived within minutes, confirmed what everyone already knew. Mahatma Gandhi was dead, killed by an assassin, murdered while going to evening prayers, struck down by the violence he had spent his life opposing. Godse made no attempt to escape, stood calmly, was seized by the crowd, was arrested by police, was taken into custody. He showed no remorse, believed he had acted righteously, was prepared to face trial and punishment, wanted to explain his ideology, to defend his action as patriotic duty rather than as murder. News of the assassination spread immediately. Radio announcements, word of mouth, telegraph messages, the nation learning within hours that Gandhi was gone, that the father of the nation had been murdered, that the apostle of non-violence had died. Violently, India was stunned, grief-stricken, terrified by what the assassination meant, uncertain whether it would provoke more violence, whether communal conflict would worsen, whether the nation would survive the loss. Nehru broadcast to the nation, "The light has gone out of our lives and there is darkness everywhere. Our beloved leader, Bapu as we called him, the father of the nation, is no more. Perhaps I am wrong to say that. Nevertheless, we will not see him again as we have seen him for these many years. We will not run to him for advice and seek solace from him, and that is a terrible blow, not to me only, but to millions and millions in this country." The assassination shocked Hindu nationalists into silence, their ideology suddenly associated with murder, their movement temporarily discredited, the RSS banned, Hindu Mahasabha marginalized. The horror of killing Gandhi made many Indians reject religious nationalism, at least temporarily, made secular democracy seem like the only acceptable path, made Gandhi's values seem more important in death than they had been in life. Gandhi's body was prepared according to Hindu ritual, was cremated at Rajghat on the banks of Yamuna River on January 31st, 1948, attended by hundreds of thousands, the funeral pyre witnessed by a grieving nation, the flames, consuming the body of the man who had freed India, who had changed the world, who had shown that empires could be challenged through non-violence, who had died trying to prevent religious hatred from destroying the independence he had won. His ashes were divided, scattered in multiple rivers across India and Pakistan, spread in Ganges and Yamuna and other sacred waters, dispersed into the land he had loved, the country he had freed, the nation he had been unable to keep united. Some ashes were kept by family, some sent to other countries, some preserved in memorials, but most were returned to water, to nature, to the eternal cycle that Gandhi had believed in. The assassination was tragedy, but also fulfillment. Gandhi had died doing his duty, had died working for peace, had died at his prayer meeting surrounded by people who loved him, had died without suffering long illness or disability, had died before, seeing whether his life's work would ultimately succeed or fail. He was spared witnessing how independent India developed, whether it maintained secular values or descended into religious nationalism, whether partition would create permanent hatred or eventual reconciliation. Chapter 17. January 1948. The final days of Mohandas Gandhi's life were consumed by the same concerns that had dominated his final years. Communal violence, Hindu-Muslim tensions, the need to protect minorities, the struggle to preserve secular, democratic values in newly independent India. He knew he was in danger, had received death threats, had survived one assassination attempt on January 20th, was aware that Hindu nationalists wanted him dead. But danger had never deterred him. Death threats had never silenced him. The possibility of assassination had never made him modify his message or his methods. He believed that if someone killed him while he was doing his duty, while working for peace, that would be an appropriate end. Perhaps even a meaningful death that would serve the cause of peace more powerfully than his continued living. His routine in those final days was predictable. Prayer meetings twice daily, spinning wheel sessions, meetings with political leaders and with ordinary people seeking his advice or blessing, correspondence with leaders in India and Pakistan, planning for his intended trip to Pakistan to preach peace in the country that had been carved from India. The prayer meetings were open to everyone, held outdoors in the garden of Birla House, attended by hundreds, conducted without security screening, without barriers between Gandhi and the crowd. Security officials urged him to accept more protection, to limit access, to screen attendees, to allow bodyguards. Gandhi refused. How could he preach fearlessness while living in fear? How could he claim to trust God's protection while depending on armed guards? On the morning of January 30th, 1948, Gandhi woke as usual before dawn, prayed, met with various visitors including Vallabhbhai Patel, one of the senior Congress leaders with whom Gandhi had complex relationship. Patel had supported partition, had been willing to compromise on unity, was more pragmatic and less idealistic than Gandhi. But they remained colleagues, worked together despite disagreements, maintained respect even when they differed. Gandhi spun cotton on his wheel, ate sparingly. His diet was always restricted, often consisting mainly of goat's milk, fruits and vegetables, maintained the simplicity that had characterized his life for decades. He was thin, weak, but his mind remained sharp, his commitment undiminished, his determination to work for peace as strong as ever. In early afternoon, he rested briefly, then began preparing for evening prayer meeting. He was late. Prayer meeting was scheduled for 5 p.m. Gandhi was usually punctual, but that day he was delayed by visitors, by meetings that ran long, emerged from Birla House only at 5:10 p.m., 10 minutes behind schedule. He walked supported by his grandnieces Abba and Manuben, one on each side, his arms on their shoulders, walking slowly toward the prayer platform where several hundred people waited, singing hymns, preparing for prayers. Gandhi greeted people with folded hands in namaste gesture, smiled, acknowledged their presence, moved through the crowd. Natharam Gods positioned himself in the front of the crowd, waited for Gandhi to approach, had the Beretta pistol concealed under his khaki jacket, was calm and determined, believed he was saving India by eliminating someone he saw as obstacle to Hindu greatness. As Gandhi approached, Godse pushed forward, bowed as if to touch Gandhi's feet in traditional gesture of respect. Abba tried to stop him, said, "Brother, Bapu is already late for prayers," pushed against Godse. He shoved her aside, moved directly in front of Gandhi, brought his hands together as if in prayer greeting, then pulled out the pistol, fired 3 times at point-blank range, shots striking Gandhi in chest and abdomen, bullets entering soft flesh, tearing through organs, causing catastrophic damage. Gandhi fell immediately, blood spreading on his white shawl, his last words either "Hey Ram," "Oh God," or perhaps just reflex sounds, his body collapsing, life fleeing rapidly. People rushed forward, tried to help, carried him back into Birla House, laid him on couch. But nothing could be done. Doctors arrived within minutes, but Gandhi was already dead or dying, breath leaving, heart stopping, 78 years of life, ending on a January evening in Delhi. God stood calmly, made no attempt to escape, was seized by the crowd, would have been killed by angry witnesses except that police arrived quickly, took him into custody, protected him from mob violence. He showed no remorse, told police he'd killed Gandhi deliberately, would explain his reasons at trial, was prepared to face death penalty, believed his action was justified. News spread through Delhi within minutes, then across India within hours. Radio broadcasts announced the assassination. Newspapers printed special editions. Word of the mouth carried the news to villages without radio or newspapers, the entire nation, learning within a day that Gandhi was dead, that the father of independence has been murdered, that India had lost the man who more than anyone else had made independence possible. The reaction was shock, grief, fear, shock that someone would kill Gandhi, grief at losing him, fear that the assassination would trigger more communal violence, that Hindu-Muslim tensions would worsen, that India might descend into chaos. But Nehru's immediate radio address, the swift arrest of the assassin, the government's decisive response, all helped maintain order, prevented immediate violence, gave India time to grieve rather than to explode. Godse was tried, convicted, sentenced to death, hanged in November 1949, remaining unrepentant, defending his action in court statement that became text for Hindu nationalists, who saw him as martyr rather than murderer. The trial revealed the conspiracy, led to conviction of co-conspirators, but could not answer deeper questions. Why had Gandhi's message of tolerance failed to prevent this? What did the assassination reveal about Indian society? Would independent India be the secular democracy Gandhi had envisioned, or would religious nationalism eventually triumph? Gandhi's assassination ended his life but began his legend. He became martyr, saint, father of the nation, symbol of non-violence and peace, inspiration for resistance movements worldwide. His actual complexity, his failures and contradictions, his evolution and his doubts were smoothed away in hagiography, replaced by simplified image of perfect pacifist who had lived without violence and who had died by violence that proved his philosophy. But Gandhi himself would have rejected sainthood, would have insisted that he was human, flawed, struggling, never fully achieving the ideals he pursued, always falling short while continuing to try. He was not Mahatma, great soul, except in the aspirational sense, not a finished saint but a work in progress, not someone who had achieved perfection, but someone who had dedicated his life to pursuing it. His death at 78 years old, murdered while going to prayer, killed by someone who believed his tolerance for Muslims betrayed Hindu interests, was both tragedy and testimony. Tragedy because it ended a life still useful, still needed, still capable of healing and teaching, but testimony to the principles he had lived by. Dying without violence, even though violence took his life, accepting death that came while pursuing peace, demonstrating to the end that courage and principle could coexist with absolute rejection of violence. At Rajghat, on the banks of the Yamuna River in Delhi, a simple black marble platform marks the spot where Mahatma Gandhi was cremated on January 31st, 1948, the day after his assassination. The memorial is austere, reflecting Gandhi's values of simplicity, inscribed with his last words, "Hey Ram," surrounded by gardens, visited by millions who come to honour the father of independent India, to remember the man who changed the world through non-violence. The legacy Gandhi left is complex, contested, powerful. He freed India from British rule without firing a shot, mobilized millions through non-violent resistance, demonstrated that empires could be defeated through moral authority and disciplined suffering, inspired independence movements and civil rights. Struggles worldwide, his philosophy of satyagraha, truth force, became template for resistance, influenced Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, and countless others who faced oppression and sought change without violence. But the legacy is also incomplete, troubled by questions that Gandhi could not answer, by problems he could not solve. He won independence but could not prevent partition, freed India from colonialism but watched it divide along religious lines, spent his final years fighting communal violence he could not eliminate, died trying to heal wounds that partition had opened. His views on caste, particularly on untouchability, were progressive for his time but seem inadequate now. He opposed untouchability but defended the Varna system, wanted to integrate Dalits into Hinduism but did not fundamentally challenge caste. Hierarchy conflicted with Dr. Ambedkar, who argued that caste could not be reformed but had to be destroyed. His position seems like moral failure, limited by the society he came from, unable to fully escape the prejudices he had been raised with. His experiments with celibacy, his tests of brahmacharya that involved sleeping naked with young women, including his grandniece to prove his self-control, seemed deeply problematic, examples of abusing power, of imposing his struggles onto others, of behaviour that would be condemned as sexual harassment or worse if done by contemporary figures. Defenders argue that context matters, that judging past by present standards is unfair, that Gandhi's intentions were spiritual, not sexual. Critics argue that intentions do not excuse harmful behaviour, that power dynamics made genuine consent impossible, that Gandhi's sexual experiments reflected disturbing attitudes about controlling women's bodies. His economic philosophy, his advocacy for village self-sufficiency and hand-spinning, his opposition to industrialization and modernization, has been largely rejected by independent India, which has pursued economic development, industrial growth, urbanization that Gandhi would have opposed. The spinning wheel remains symbol but not practice. The vision of village-centered India has not materialized. Modernization has proceeded despite Gandhi's warnings about its spiritual costs. But his core insights remain powerful. That violence begets violence. That oppression can be resisted without becoming oppressor. That moral authority is a form of power. That willingness to suffer can move hearts and change societies. That truth and justice are worth sacrificing for. That ends do not justify means, but rather means determine ends. His method of satyagraha, refined through decades of struggle in South Africa and India, provided practical tools for resistance. Civil disobedience, non-cooperation, fasting, willingness to accept arrest and punishment, maintaining discipline under provocation, persisting despite setbacks, refusing to hate enemies while opposing their actions. These methods worked, defeated British Empire, freed India, demonstrated that non-violence was practical politics, not just moral philosophy. The photograph of Gandhi that is most recognized worldwide shows him at 76 years old, bald, toothless, wearing only white dhoti and shawl, carrying a walking stick, looking frail but determined. The image captures his essence, his simplicity, his identification with the poor, his rejection of material wealth, his transformation from London-educated lawyer into half-naked fakir who challenged empire and won. He lived simply, owned almost nothing at his death, a few dhotis, his glasses, his pocket watch, his spinning wheel, his wooden eating bowl. These possessions were divided among museums and family, preserved as relics, worshipped by some as holy objects, examined by others as artifacts of a complex human life. India honours him officially. His birthday is national holiday. His image is on currency. Statues stand in public squares. His name is invoked by politicians across political spectrum. His principles are taught in schools. But does independent India embody his values? Secular democracy persists but is challenged by religious nationalism. Non-violence is praised but violence is common. Simplicity is respected but materialism dominates. Unity is celebrated but divisions remain. The questions Gandhi grappled with remain urgent. How should religious communities coexist? How can societies address historical injustices without creating new ones? How can modernity's benefits be achieved without losing spiritual depth? How can violence be resisted without using violence? How can individuals live ethically in unjust societies? The answers he offered are not final, are not complete, but they are serious attempts, deserve consideration, remain relevant. His greatest achievement was not freeing India, though that was enormous, but demonstrating that political change can come through moral transformation, that resistance need not be violent to be effective, that ordinary people mobilized by shared purpose can defeat powerful institutions, that truth and justice are forces that ultimately overcome tyranny, even when tyranny seems invincible. His greatest failure was not preventing partition, though he tried desperately, but was his inability to eliminate communal hatred, to convince Hindus and Muslims that they were one people rather than two nations, to preserve the unity that he believed was essential for India's future, to prevent religious identity from becoming basis for political division. But perhaps the attempt matters more than the success, the effort more than the outcome, the principles more than the results. Gandhi tried, persisted, never surrendered to despair or hatred, maintained his commitment to non-violence even when violence surrounded him, died pursuing peace even when peace seemed impossible. The memorial at Rajghat is simple, as Gandhi would have wanted. No grand monument, no elaborate structure, just black marble and the words, "Hey Ram," and the memory of a life dedicated to freeing a nation and healing a world. Visitors come daily, place flowers, stand silently, remember the man who lived 78 years, who freed India, who inspired millions, who died by violence while preaching non-violence, who remains both inspiration and challenge, both success and failure, both saint and human, both Mahatma and Mohandas. The life is over, ended on a January evening in 1948, ended by assassins' bullets, ended at prayer meeting, ended while walking toward prayer platform, ended doing what he had done for decades, working for peace, preaching tolerance, living his principles, refusing to surrender to hatred or fear. The life ended, but the example remains, the methods persist, the questions echo, the challenge endures. Can we live without violence? Can we resist injustice without becoming unjust? Can we change the world through moral force rather than through physical force? Gandhi answered yes, proved it possible, showed the way. Whether we follow remains our choice.